Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury is today calling for thousands of hectares of land owned by the Church of England to be used to build affordable housing. He's also calling for the government to do more to provide affordable homes too. Well, I'm delighted to say the Archbishop Justin Welby joins us now. So just tell us, what is the idea behind this report from the Church of England?
The report's an independent report chaired by Mr. Charles Arbuthnot, and who's had a lifetime experience in housing, with a very powerful group of very diverse people, and the vice chair is the Bishop of Kensington, in whose area is Grenfell Tower. It's an independent report which has worked for 2.5 years and looks at the crisis in housing, the 8 million people in inadequate housing, the poor housing, the diversity issues that mean that people in black and minority ethnic communities have had worse outcomes in the pandemic and so on. And it provides great challenges to the Church of England, to the government, to individuals and to landowners. It's a very powerful report setting a vision for 20 years of housing.
It's a very wide-ranging report as well. There's a list of things you want the government to do, from increasing housing benefit to committing to more affordable homes. How big an impact have benefit cuts had, and would you like to see the £20 a week increase to universal credit maintained?
I think the report mainly focuses on the issues around affordable housing, and the £20 benefit is something that a number of bishops have spoken up in favour of. And certainly when you look at the demand on food banks and areas like that, we need to try and strengthen people who are really up against it. But the issue today is affordable housing, not just available housing. We've tried to set out a vision in the way that was set out in the 1940s for health. We know in the health service that the aim is that health should be delivered free at the point of need, good healthcare free at the point of need. Everyone agrees on that. It's cross-party, it is the objective. There is no equivalent in housing. And there is no definition of affordable housing. The Minister said that in the House of Lords last week. There is a need for every part of society. We talk to the government, or the report, it's not us yet, though I very much welcome and support the report. It talks to the government, but it also challenges the church. And the challenge to the church is, where is your soul? Where are your values? Do you believe what Jesus said, that you love God with all your heart, soul, strength and mind, and you love your neighbour as yourself? Because if you do, you are going to want stable, sociable, sustainable, safe and secure housing right across society. And that's the challenge to the church, to use its land and be a leader in this area.
Yeah, of course, so many of the issues that people experience with housing have just been exacerbated in the last year with lockdowns, the pandemic meaning you're spending more time at home, of course. You're talking about the challenge to the church, but this is also clearly a challenge to government as well. Do you feel that you're having to step in because the government hasn't done enough?
It's not this government. The housing crisis goes back at least to the mid-1970s. And, you know, Cathy Come Home, you'd know of that film. Ken Loach, right back in the 60s, talking about poor housing. That had an immense effect at the time, but we have far more people in private rented accommodation then than we do now. And we have far more people, a far higher proportion of the population in inadequate housing now than we did then. And so this isn't about this government or its immediate predecessors. It goes right back through all parties, and we need a national common vision for housing, and that will be sacrificial. The report calls on the church to be sacrificial, not to take its maximum possible benefit. That is the challenge that I welcome and support, and I affirm that call and call on the church to react in that way. And it calls on government and landowners in the same way.
OK. You mentioned Grenfell in your first answer. Do you think more needs to be done to remove dangerous cladding from high rises?
Absolutely, I do. And that is one of the keynote recommendations in the report that the government, the report recommends, as I say, it's independent, but I support this, that the government take responsibility for the cladding. They've announced 3.2 billion, I think, a couple of weeks ago, but that may well not be enough, and then recover that from developers and other people.
OK, now I just want to ask you a little bit about coronavirus, because of course we're all waiting for the Prime Minister to announce the roadmap out of lockdown. I know there's lots of concern about the amount of school that children have been missing. What would you like to see tomorrow?
Well, a roadmap is a very important thing, but it has to be one that we can be really confident about. Sophie, you know as well as I do that this last lockdown has been one of the most painful for the most people. I go into a local hospital as an assistant chaplain, and you see the exhaustion of the staff, the way they're worn down. We need a roadmap that will stop us going up and down. And I know the government is deeply committed to that. The huge success of the vaccine programme speaks to what we can do. And I think it needs to be secure and that we know it is going to be delivered so we can all move forward. I mean, the pandemic has stripped the paper off the cracks, which we've covered up. There's a schools crisis because children have missed a year of education or had a disrupted year, not all missed it, thanks to the heroism and the quality of the schools. There's a housing crisis, which has been revealed in its full extent. The health service is desperately tired. There is a huge need for a clear roadmap, and I'm sure the government is working on that and will produce that.
Are they right to prioritise the reopening of schools?
I'm absolutely sure they're right to prioritise the opening of the schools. That is probably the most urgent thing. It's been the most urgent thing right the way through. I remember talking to one of the senior medical advisors last year. He said, because the Church of England educates more than 1 million children in its schools, and he said, whatever you do everything you can to keep the schools going, because the damage to children's mental health, their long-term education is so serious.
You mentioned the success of the vaccine rollout in the UK, and I know that you've previously been quite critical of countries buying up more vaccines than they need. At what point do you think the UK should donate vaccines to poorer countries, so many of which haven't vaccinated anyone at all?
Well, the Anglican Communion, of which technically I'm the sort of senior bishop in the world, is 80 million people in 165 countries. And the average Anglican is a woman in her 30s on less than $4 a day, probably in an area of conflict or persecution. So most of my work is with the very poor around the world. I'm very pleased that not only has this government done very, very well on the vaccine programme, but it's also leading the world on the international distribution of vaccines. And I welcome that warmly. I hope that others follow that example. Bill Gates has called for that and is himself putting huge sums of money into this. I hope that across Europe we do this as soon as they've sorted out their own problems on basic distribution of vaccine. And I hope places like Canada and the United States do that. We keep saying this won't be defeated anywhere until it's defeated everywhere. And certainly in many parts of the world, they need massive support with this. And we are doing very well on that.
It's the first time I've interviewed you, so I have a couple of other questions, if I may. You said last summer, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, that the church would very carefully review statues at some of its major places of worship, Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. And then you said that some will have to come down, some names will have to change. That was 8 months ago. Have you removed any statues with links to the slave trade? And do you think that's something the church should continue to look at?
I'm really pleased that there have been very few that needed to be removed that couldn't simply be put in context, and the context the statue explained. Canterbury, thankfully, hasn't had to take anything down. I really welcome that. I think in total something like 2 have been put in museums or something across the whole country, and we're talking tens of thousands. So that's very, very good news. But we come back to the underlying issue here, which is slavery and the legacy of slavery, the impact it had on so many people and so many parts of the world, and still has on the minority ethnic populations through racism in this country. And we have to put resources in to supporting them and demonstrating that we are all equal in this country, that there is an end to injustice, racial injustice, among others, in this country. That's part of the reason for the housing report.
Talking about modernising the church, would you like to see a woman archbishop one day?
The church, people in the church would be very relieved to know that I have no influence on my successor. I'd be delighted. What I want to see is diversity of leadership, in which leadership is anointed by the Holy Spirit of God, and in which they love Jesus Christ and they love their neighbour and enable millions of people to discover the love of Christ for them.
And then just finally, of course, the royal family and the church have a very strong and historic connection. Were you sad to see the news that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are going to step back from royal duties?
I don't comment on the royal family in public. If I have anything to say, it would be said in private.
OK, that is fair enough. Archbishop, thank you so much for coming on the programme and talking about the very important report into housing, such a key issue, of course, for so many people at the minute. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
We were just talking there about housing. The Ministry of Housing have sent us this statement in response to the Archbishop's report. We welcome and encourage the practical steps that the Church is taking to make more of their land available for affordable housing. We've delivered over 500,000 new affordable homes since 2010. We're supporting renters by extending notice periods and banning bailiff enforcement of evictions. And we're spending billions of pounds to remove cladding so people's homes are safe.